Is it better to reward player behavior that you'd like them to take, or punish the behavior you want them to avoid? This is a foundational question in rules writing. Even when mathematically a rule can be mostly identical, you can construct them in different ways, either rewarding or punishing. Hi, I'm Peter, creator and lead designer of Tales from Elsewhere, and this week's video is going to be an examination of reward and punishment in rules writing. So we're going to look at things like opportunity attacks, ranged weapons, stacking advantage and disadvantage, really everything that goes into making carrots and sticks. As we always do on this channel, let's start off by defining some terms and feeling our way through the baseline idea we're going to work through today. So we're here to talk about incentivization in tabletop role-playing games. Now, in addition to what I'll be talking about today, I did record another video some time ago about motivating through mechanics. You don't need to have watched that before, but it'll act as a good companion piece to this one. We'll put a link down below and probably link it at the end of the video. It's worth checking out if you found this topic interesting. In game design, a carrot, put simply, is some sort of rule that provides a benefit to the players. This would be things like you gain a bonus when you take certain actions, or you gain a meta currency, or some sort of behavior is rewarded. On the other end, a stick is a penalty rule. It's something that gives you a drawback for taking some action, whether that be straining yourself or getting a die roll penalty or some sort of disadvantage. Sticks are used to smack the hand when the player attempts to do something you don't really want them to do without issue. And now, it's important to understand that carrots and sticks both have a use within game design. It's not like carrots are always better than sticks or vice versa. And as we look through examples, we'll think through how we would want to approach those when we're designing our own content. Because carrots are things you want the player to feel good about doing, and sticks are useful for making a player feel more tension or pressure from the system when they attempt to do it without taking proper precautions or whatever that rule structure may be. So don't think of them as good and bad, think about them as tools you can leverage in game design. Let's go through some examples using pseudo rules, but are based on my actual game design journey for the game that I made called Tales from Elsewhere. Because I always find that a useful method for showing in real life how these sort of disciplines can be applied. So let's say we are designing firearm rules. Let's say you're making a Weird West game like I did, and you want to involve some sort of aiming rule structure, right? Where, somebody takes careful aim with their 6-shooter before shooting, and that's somehow reflected in the rules. You could design that as a carrot, where if you aim before shooting, you gain some bonus to the roll, right? Or you could construct that as a stick. If you don't aim first, your shots have some sort of penalty. And these could numerically be mirrors of each other. They could be mathematically equivalent in your rule system, but they're very different experientially at the table. And that's because when you're using a stick method, the baseline experience of using that action, in this case shooting a gun, is negative. The game system is applying pressure to the player to not do that. If you shoot from the hip, as it were, that has a penalty. And that's telling the players that shooting from the hip, or just pulling out your gun and shooting it, is not the best way to approach combat. There comes with that approach a penalty that you are suffering. Instead, if you make the baseline shooting experience, the numbers that go into that, perfectly fine, and you simply present aiming as an extra benefit you gain to the shot, it makes just pulling out your gun and shooting from the hip not feel like a negative experience, but the careful aim is rewarded. And this distinction, I think, is very important when you're going to build a rule that the players will interact with very frequently. Like in a Western game, shooting their 6-shooter. You don't want the core experience the player is interacting with on a moment-to-moment basis to be a stick, because that means that their core experience is negative or negatively reinforced within the rule system. Instead, I believe it is better to use the carrot in this situation. You want your rootin' tootin' cowboys to be pulling out their guns and shooting them, but you want to reward those who take careful aim with their lever rifle before popping off a shot. And that's why I believe carrot structures like this are generally better for the kinds of things that you want the players to be doing frequently. Because what sort of behavior you punish in a game is communicating to the player what they should not be doing. So by making all firearm attacks have a penalty as presented in the rules, you're telling them don't shoot your firearm unless you can aim first. That's an ideological shift that you're imparting on the players, usually subconsciously, in comparison to carrot-related structures. Let's look at another example. Let's say we're talking about having medical supplies in a game, like a medical kit. If you want players to want to have this sort of piece of gear, it needs to have some sort of rules associated with it to make it worthwhile in your game. So the carrot version would say treating injuries is easier with a medical kit, while the stick version would be the opposite. Treating injuries is harder without a medical kit. In either case, the players will want to have a medical kit on them because it is beneficial to do so. But just like with the firearm rules, if you're telling them that treating an injury without a medical kit is hard, you are saying that treating injuries is hard baseline. If you're telling them that treating injuries is easier with a medical kit, it will make them think they can give it a try even if they don't have a medical kit. The way you construct the underlying math can really shift here in a subtle but impactful way. If the baseline operations of what the characters can do is built under the assumption of carrots, as in that there aren't any sticks necessarily to it, it will make your core resolution feel smoother. What I mean by that is, it won't be that the players are dodging penalties the whole time they're playing. Instead, they're looking for benefits. And I believe, and this is where I'm going to bring in a little bit of my own bias here maybe, I believe that carrot structure feels better for the players, where the gameplay experience they're having isn't one where they feel punished by the rules, they feel rewarded the further they engage. The more prepared they are with their medical supplies, the better they will be at treating injuries. Or in the case of firearms, the more that they aim and take care, the more accurate they will become. But them treating injuries or shooting their revolver, all of those experiences aren't constructed around a negative reinforcement baseline. And remember, in either case, we want the players to desire the medical kit, right? We want this piece of equipment to feel like it matters. It's a question of how much you want it to matter, how hard you want that to be. Now, like I said just a moment ago, I have a preference for carrots in general, but if you want your game to have this sort of gritty and punitive feeling to it, where the players feel overwhelmed by the system itself, right? Overwhelmed by the penalties levied against them, then using sticks can really help reinforce that. There's a lot of OSR design that can be a little bit stick heavy because it's supposed to feel punishing when you don't think your way through a problem. And that's a whole ideological structure we're not going to delve into here. But I think you should definitely be careful with the prevalence of sticks that you include in a system, because you don't want a system to be all sticks. Then the gameplay is all about dodging penalties. Now, the examples we've used so far are very straightforward numerical carrots and sticks. Let's look at something that's a little bit more controversial and less clear. Let's look at opportunity attacks. Opportunity attacks are something you see in most tactical tabletop role-playing games, things like Dungeons and Dragons and so forth, will use some sort of attacks of opportunity structure. And they're usually phrased something like, if a character moves while adjacent to an enemy, the enemy can make a free attack against them. Something like that. Now, this is a stick structure that is meant to punish a certain behavior, right? Moving without disengaging or some other protection will incur a penalty on you in the form of a free attack from an enemy. Now, the calculus of whether or not that's worth it is significantly more complex than simply a bonus or a bane to a die roll, but it is nonetheless very much a stick-type behavior. This is now punishing a type of reckless behavior that the system doesn't want you to do. In a game like D&D, they don't want you to freely run around the battlefield, nor do they want the enemies to do so either. So they provide everybody with this baseline stick, almost quite literally, to smack characters that don't follow that behavior, that incentivized behavior. But if you've played a lot of D&D, you've probably experienced the following. After round 1, when all of the battle lines have been drawn, as it were, and people have engaged with their intended target, there's basically 0 movement unless a target dies. And that's because granting enemies a free attack is quite punishing for a lot of monsters in D&D, especially in the 2024 rules where many monsters have riders to their attacks that don't allow a save. They simply impart a penalty if they hit. And that can mean granting a giant constrictor snake a free opportunity to restrain you again and start crushing you is quite punishing. Especially considering how many enemies there can be and how many opportunity attacks you could trigger against them. Monsters also don't frequently have other uses for their reactions, so they're ready to go with those opportunity attacks. So this stick is a pretty heavy stick, and the weight of that stick is why I actually ended up removing it from my tabletop role-playing game. I wanted my players to move around the battlefield. I wanted them to threat assess objectives and other things they needed to do without having to worry about giving enemies a free attack. And that's really important for my system because it's so deadly. Giving a monster a free attack is a death sentence in my game. It's very, very bad to do that. And as soon as I removed this rule structure, the flow of my combat improved significantly. And what it does though, because my game has body targeting, called shots and all these other actions you can take baseline, it rewards players for doing so in the combat. So if you want an enemy to not be able to run away, you can shoot him in the leg. That's how you control movement. You can grab hold of somebody and hold them in place, and it's quite effective to do so in the rules. And certain monsters are designed with a special reaction that would let them grab an enemy, like snatch them up in their jaws if they need to, if they try to flee, but all of that is telegraphed. By removing a stick that punishes movement, surprise, surprise, people move more. So it's worth really thinking intentionally about opportunity attacks and their related cousins in design, where it can be so heavy a stick that you'll stagnate your game for fear of people getting hit by it. And now let's switch gears slightly, and I'd like to talk about the way that carrots and sticks can stack and negate each other, because this also changes your calculation when designing a game. We're going to look at D&D 5th edition as our main example here because most people are familiar with it and their advantage and disadvantage is pretty straightforward. So D&D has an advantage and disadvantage structure. If you have advantage, you roll 2d20, keep the higher. If you have disadvantage, you roll 2d20, keep the lower. So advantage is obviously a carrot and disadvantage is obviously a stick. For example, if you try to use a ranged weapon while adjacent to an enemy, you have disadvantage. If the enemy is prone and you try to attack them with a melee weapon, you have advantage on the roll. So on and so forth. Now, in D&D 5e, no matter how many instances of advantage you have, no matter how many carrots, they are negated by a single stick. And similarly, no matter how many sticks I have, they're all negated by a single carrot. That's because advantage and disadvantage do not stack in D&D. Now, that is a criticism levied against the game from time to time, and we've seen in a lot of D&D heartbreakers or competitors the desire to have them stack. I believe a good example of this in recent memory would be DC 20 by Dungeon Coach. I know it's not fully out yet, but in his game, advantage and disadvantage stack, and it's about comparing the difference between the two. So if I have 4 carrots and 3 sticks, I'm left with 1 carrot. And what this means, though, is the game, moment to moment, is now about stacking carrots for you and stacking sticks on the enemy. It changes the way that the players interact with the game. In D&D 5e, all you need is 1 carrot to counteract any number of sticks. So you're doing less of a carrot hunt. Similarly, if you already have a bunch of carrots, one stick counteracts them all. This means you're only ever hunting for one instance of either. You want your opponent to have disadvantage, just one of them is plenty, and ideally you want to have advantage and avoid the disadvantage. When you can stack them, the player's calculation during their turn is now about how many carrots they can find, right? And that comes with its own cost for a game. Now, yes, mathematically that's very interesting, and there's a lot of power you can gain and that feeling of power by stacking either advantages or disadvantages. But again, the focus of the game has now shifted. That occupies a larger space within the player's brain on a given turn, in a given moment. And you have to ask yourself if this is what you'd like the players to be thinking about. Do you want them to be counting advantages and stacking them? Or do you want them to be engaging with some other aspect of your role-playing game? For Tales from Elsewhere, I knew that I wanted a simple advantage-disadvantage system at least. We have high roll, low roll, using a little bit more of a flavorful term. But I did it the way that D&D 5e did it, where they just cancel each other out and don't stack. And the reason is I don't want the players to be spending all of their time hunting carrots. I want them to be engaging within the brutal and visceral injury system that the game focuses on. So I wanted their approach to an advantage-disadvantage to be expedient and simple to calculate, so they can move on to thinking which limb on the blood oiler is more important to blow off with their shotgun first, rather than counting carrots. But that's what works for my game, based on the design goals and principles that I wanted to focus on within it. And that doesn't mean it's going to be the right answer for you. But, as I said earlier in this video, I'd really like folks to think hard about whether or not they want to focus on advantage or disadvantage, carrots and sticks. And this whole conversation came about because I was talking with a fellow community member in the big tabletop role-playing game design server that I'm a member of and a moderator of. This is one of the biggest places to talk shop with other hobbyists and designers about tabletop role-playing game design. I've been a member for over a year. It is awesome. I will put a link down below to join that server. It has, I think, approaching 3,000 members within it. There's always people talking in all sorts of different time zones, and I've found it to be a wonderful benefit and to me as an indie designer, just with other passionate people to bounce ideas off of. So if you are making your own tabletop role-playing game, I recommend checking it out. It's a very cool place. There's also the Tales from Elsewhere Discord server, which is a little bit more focused in on my game and sort of the design principles that go into it, but we also have lots of indie designers in there. So if these kinds of discussions and debates sound interesting to you, they happen all the time in these community servers. So links down below to those for you to check out. Well, I hope you found that interesting. If you are working on your own tabletop role-playing game or interesting homebrew, hit me in the comments below with what you're working on. I'm always interested to see how people handle their carrots and sticks. If you'd like to find out more about the game I built, we're actually still accepting late pledges to the Tales from Elsewhere Clockworld Kickstarter. There's only a few weeks left on this before we close it out, so if you'd like to pre-order a PDF or the hard copy, there'll be a link down below to go check that out. We're really excited to bring it to you. And as always, if you'd like to really dig into even more, I release an additional video every week on the Tales from Elsewhere Patreon page. This is a place where I post dev blog videos and talk through my additional thoughts about various game design topics. Everything down below will have a link. Now, if you're feeling particularly nice today, you can always like and subscribe to this video, as that also helps the channel and helps get the word out there about what we're working on here at Tales from Elsewhere. So, I hope to see you here next time.